event at the Australian International Education Conference. It's great to have a diverse time zone represented, even though we're all in Hobart. So firstly, I'll introduce you all, Robin Marsh, Joan Dassin and Matt Mawer, who are all editors of a book that will be published, I believe, next week, if my dates are correct.
October.
Yeah, October the 17th, I think, is the last date that I saw on the website. So international scholarships in higher education, pathways for social change. So first of all, if I could get you to give us an outline of how the book came about, why you decided to write this publication. Maybe we could start with Robin.
Okay, well, I was in the midst of researching and writing a relevant study, which was looking at the life and career trajectories of African alumni of international universities. And my own university, University of California, Berkeley, was among those that participated. And somehow, I can't remember, Joan will have to say how, but people who were involved in assessing and evaluating international scholarship programs felt that there was a need to get together and recognize and assess these new studies. And so we had a workshop in Boston back at NAFSA, right, in 2015, I believe. Mm-hmm. And the three of us were there, and Joan and Matt called it together. I was present, and there were a number of other international scholarship program directors. And so in the course of that conversation, and particularly the input from Matt, we realized that there were actually a lot of interesting and more deeper assessments going on the outcomes of international scholarship programs going back in time, maybe, since post-war. And that maybe it was time for a book to bring these studies together. And then as we discussed, who would be the authors in the book and what would be the main topics, we began to focus in on the question of whether these international scholarships are actually pathways to the kind of social change we were interested in seeing, and a lot of scholarship program officers are interested in seeing. And there was, to some degree, some belief that this was happening, but there wasn't the evidence, and there wasn't really, a good standing to be able to say that definitively. So we came together and we asked that question, and we brought the authors who we thought could deliver some evidence for that, and that's how it got going.
Mm-hmm. And there were, of course, antecedents to that would be worth recounting. I think all of us had come from either research or actually implementation of scholarship programs that were focused particularly on this notion of social change in developing countries, in the sending countries. And I myself had come from a number of years working on a big international fellowship program sponsored by the Ford Foundation that was very explicitly geared toward creating social change in the home or sending countries of the students. So I think that I would just reinforce what Robin said, that there was an interest in really delimiting a field of research, policy, and practice around this question of what actually would be the relationship between an individual scholarship recipient and broader social effects. And so we didn't have a very good comprehensive view of what had been done in terms of research, although we knew a lot of people who were working on these programs from one perspective or another. So the timing was right, and we were able to convene this group, as Robin pointed out, at the NAFSA meeting here in Boston, which allowed us to take a free ride, really, on people who otherwise would have been attending in any case. And we brought at that meeting together, and we actually co-sponsored that meeting, as I recall, between the Association of Commonwealth Universities, where Matt was working, and Brandeis University, where I am now working.
Great. And in terms of that practitioner researcher divide, I think that's one of the things that I find most striking and interesting about both the book and the field more generally, is that there are a lot of people who bridge that divide, every day, and it seems that that's well represented in the book as well.
Yeah, so I think that was also part of the origin story of the book. So just picking up what Joan said at the very end of her comments, I think some of the origin of the book is in a kind of community building exercise, because scholarship programs in their design, administration, and then analysis span a lot of sectoral spaces. So there are people working in this field who are in non-profits, who are in government organizations, who are in government, central government itself, supranationals, academic staff, and so forth. So we were quite keen to try and bridge some of those spaces and bring people together who we knew were working in this field but might not necessarily be talking to each other very actively. I think that's particularly true across government and academia. Sometimes have a little bit of a closer discussion, but this kind of triad of big non-profits and foundations, government and academia is not a trinity you see all that often, I would say, and we were very keen to try and bridge that divide somewhat, and I think that partly speaks to this researcher practitioner discussion as well. How do you bring together researchers and practitioners, as well as kind of focusing on working with the people who are fulfilling both roles at the same time, which is much more common, I think, in non-profits and big foundations than it is within the academic spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also say that we had I think an increasing awareness that even large programs and even very long-standing programs such as the Commonwealth Scholars Plan had much more of an interest in rigorous evaluation, partly because of competing pressures, partly because of the need to demonstrate impact and value for money, than had been the case even a dozen or years ago or several decades ago. So within the practice space, there is, in fact, more interest in research and evaluation than had previously been the case. The other bridging spaces that the book was able to do, and I think this is very important, is to bring different national perspectives, not only different institutional perspectives, but people from different parts of the world. And we were very keen on making sure that we had a Chinese scholar writing about China and people who were very familiar with their local situations, their national situations, contributing their perspectives. So it was important for us to take advantage of our own networks of researchers, practitioners, to build a truly international perspective on the topic.
Excellent. And given that you've now read all the contributions, how significant do you think that scholarships can be in social change in communities and nations? Do you think that they are bigger or smaller in their impact than you first thought when you first, started?
I can say, well, probably Joan and Matt were more aware of the data than I was, but I was surprised at the relative small number of international students that do receive full scholarships. There's 4 million, I believe, is the figure that people are saying is the number, but more like 5% have full international scholarships, and more have partial. So there's a lot of international student mobility that is privately funded. And that means that international scholarships are actually vital for giving access to higher education for those that cannot fund it from families or friends, or cannot fund it if it's only partial. And so immediately the numbers told us that the access issue is huge. And access financially, number one, but then also those programs that have certain recruitment mechanisms to dig deep, to go into non-elite communities and recruit, prepare, both on the part of the recipient and then on the part of the university to accept what I think sometimes is called a non-traditional, high-achieving, high-promise, but non-traditional student, maybe in terms of language skills or scores or that sort of thing. So I think we did find that if we really want to make some bridge this enormous gap in access to quality higher education, scholarships have a fundamental role to play. We also realize the huge gap between demand and supply. There's going to be much, much more demand. There is already, and it's going to increase for higher education. And these scholarship programs will never be able to meet that demand, and certainly not the more traditional south-north pathway. So we did look at the trends in distance learning and hybrid programs, joint programs, the regional hubs that are growing for quality universities outside of the OECD countries, and just investments in local universities in the developing world as probably the way of the future to meet that demand. I think we all acknowledge that. And then, and I don't want to go on too long, then it was really interesting to say, okay, so if the full degree international scholarship type of program is going to continue, even though it's not going to meet the demand, what can we say about how important it is? Should it continue to exist, even if it's just 5%? And that's when we began to look at the evidence on social change. These people who go through these programs, who have the in-residence experience and that kind of deep exposure to an international environment, the university and beyond, what are we seeing about their post-graduation trajectory that leads us to believe this should continue? And I think we found some evidence for that.
Yeah.
I think if I can just add something quickly, that the word significance, I think, is always an interesting one from an analytic perspective, not just because of the kind of statistical connotations, but when I think of significance in terms of scholarship programs analytically, I'm thinking about what do we know about the outcomes and what do we know about the mechanism by which those outcomes are achieved. And that's something we look at in the book quite a lot. And I think a conclusion that we draw across several chapters is that we know a lot about some elements of the outcomes, kind of intermediate range stuff around individual trajectories. We know somewhat less about the longer range outcomes in terms of catalytic effects on social change, diplomatic impacts, which are often cited in scholarship program rationale as well. And more generally, we know probably more about outcomes than we do about mechanisms, process level understanding of scholarships. And I think when you asked what the origin story and the title of the book was, that's, I think, a reflection. This whole phrase, pathways to social change, is reflected in the idea that we need to know more actually about the mechanisms, about the pathways, to know how significant in individual cases or in aggregate scholarship programs actually are.
Right. I would say actually that, taking off on that point, emphasizing the plural in pathways. So what we concluded, yes, there is a relationship clearly between scholarships that have as their objective some sort of societal impact beyond the individual recipient, but those impacts are mediated by a whole series of different kinds of factors, so that there are multiple pathways to social change. And from a policy standpoint or a strategic program standpoint, the goal is to try to maximize those social change outcomes. And so if you were to try to do that, you would want to look in a specific context at a particular country. What are the needs? So I think the ultimate conclusion was, yes, the title was not wrong. It was important to postulate that there is this relationship, but there are many different multiple pathways, and there are a whole series of these mediating factors which can be positive or negative. And that's why it's difficult to just come up with a single policy prescription. You know, that said, I think if pressed against the wall, and this was partly my own experience coming into the writing of the book, I would make a strong case for a very important pathway, being this pathway of broadening access to quality higher education, which is different from a diplomatic objective, or different, for example, from a institutional perspective, which is trying to, let's say, a program that's trying to strengthen a capability in a particular public administration sector or something of that sort. So targeting scholarships to people who have a track record of being change agents already turns out to be a fairly good predictive factor that those impacts will be maximized along the way. Many other features of how, or mechanisms by which these impacts can be increased also came out in the book, such as around transitional support, post-graduation, building alumni networks, or even preparatory training to ensure access. All of those different aspects of a design really can be used to enhance the social impact outcome.
And we tried to unpack a little bit what we could call the black box of the university experience itself, because we do know more about the selection processes, the preparation processes, because the scholarship programs have a relative control over that, and we know through these impact and evaluations something about the post-graduation trajectories. But really, universities, in a sense, just say, you know, give me your students and give me your money, and now it's up to us. And that it actually, in these assessments, we're finding out that the university experience makes a big difference in whether, you know, they go on to a social change related career. And so we looked at that. We looked at the fields that they studied, how important that was, for instance, in determining whether they would return home or not, or it would be a delayed return. We looked at the level of education from undergraduate to master's to PhD. Also, that has an influence. And then we began to look, well, issues of exposure. For instance, if people during their years abroad go beyond the classroom and are involved in volunteerism and civic action and internships, building up, real life experiences in democracy, in democratic action, or in civic organizations and so forth during their 4 years. And finally, we began to look, and this was through the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program in the chapter of Aaron Baxter, are universities teaming or willing to team somewhat with scholarship programs to offer leadership skills building type of activities during their 2 to 4 to 6 years, or however long they're there for their program, so that it's, you know, you may find someone with that inclination, but can they build those skills during their 4 years? And essentially prepare themselves for perhaps returning to negative, difficult environments and having that confidence and those skills to take that on. And so, yeah, it's not easy, but we begin with the little evidence that we have. We began to unpack that 4-year experience, or 2-year, in the university. And honestly, I'm not sure. And this is one, in terms of our book, we're going to have some book launches within universities with the hope that they'll pay attention to this. There is a little bit of, as I say, a hands-off that they really don't want to be dictated to with respect to how to make this experience the best for their international students from the point of view of being effective when they return home. They just assume, lucky student got into my university with a scholarship, full stop. So I think this is an area, I don't know about Matt and Joan, I think this is an area, if we could use our book to communicate with university administrators and faculty on this issue, it would be a good thing.
I think there's probably some truth in that, but at risk of sounding a little mediating, I suspect that that's not universally the case, and I certainly know of some of the universities we used to work with the Commonwealth scholarships, which were a lot more engaged with actually the social impacts of their courses, the development agenda both of the scholarships and also of their courses as well, because many of the courses that students were actually being placed on were not kind of abstract mathematics or something like that. They were related to live development issues like climate change, civic participation and democracy, international law, all of these kinds of courses. And actually the academics who were involved in running them, just as much as the designers of the scholarship programs, were quite committed to the agenda of empowering individuals to make change in those areas and to advocate for well, whatever the values of the particular course were in question. So I wouldn't want to push that too far. I'm sure there are some academic faculty and some universities which are perhaps a little blasé about their elite status and that students should be thankful just to get in, but I don't think that's universally the case.
Right. I would just, as someone directing a program of international development at the moment with some scholarship students, I would say, hopefully we fit into that former category that Matt described. But the point is that from a placement point of view, looking at how, back to this idea of how you maximize these social change outputs, there's a lot of experience now that shows that the type of course should be considered not only in terms of the academic content, but in terms of where the program positions itself relative to some of the issues that students are likely to be engaged with after their studies. And that's becoming, I think, more understood. It's not just about academic rankings. I would also emphasize, Anna, you may have another question, but we've been talking a lot about the kinds of policy/practice issues involved in actually designing and implementing a scholarship program and how one can kind of identify a route to having social change impacts. I think the book also makes a very important contribution around by summarizing the state of knowledge. Matt does this in his chapter. What do we know about evaluation outcomes? What does the literature tell us? What are the lessons about the research methodologies? Mirka Martel's chapter looks at this, and some ideas for what a future research agenda should look like that would hopefully then be filtered back or passed back into the policy and practice of the actual programs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that side of things is obviously, being a research student myself, something that I'm very interested in, where the future of this is. It's interesting to me to see where things are heading and the directions they're going. But certainly I think what I think Robin was speaking about, perhaps it's you, Joan, about the role of alumni. That is something that the Australian government is investing quite heavily in, both for sponsored or scholarship students, so Australia Awards alumni, but also broader alumni from any student who's studied in Australia. Do you think that I guess it's always that challenge of should we invest money in ensuring the outcomes, or should we invest money on broadening the access and getting more students in? Do you think that line can be tread easily, or is it that challenge between more is better, or deeper, longer, stronger is better?
I just could say one thing. Martha Lorkey struggles with this a little bit in her chapter she's from the Open Society Foundation, and she's the head of that scholarship program, and so they are looking at the relative benefits and costs of recruiting more scholars versus investment in what they call the post-graduation enhancements and support, and one of which is an alumni network. And I think the chapter comes out in the end saying that if you're interested in social change outcomes, you really need to put some of your money into the alumni networks and into the post-graduation enhancement. And in fact, that investment is smaller than a full scholarship. So you should be able to do both if you care about social change. And I applaud the Australians for doing this. The issue is, how do you create and facilitate a dynamic alumni network in this world of, over commitment and, so many opportunities to connect in many, many different ways, and how do you make that special and empowering for people? And so there's, I encourage you guys to look at those networks that seem to really become what we might call communities of practice, the go-to when you need support and advice, when you're looking for partners, when you want to start a business or organization, when you are in trouble, whatever it is, to have a go-to network of people that somehow you feel some common ground, and that can be a platform for individual success, or maybe even finding partners for collective endeavors. So yes, it's good for the research simply to ask the question, where are you? What are you doing? And we want to keep in touch with you on a regular basis. We want to follow you. That's good in itself. And then the other is, how can these alumni support one another, beyond just keeping in touch? I've run those kinds of alumni networks myself, and I know what it is like to have one that is minimally functioning versus one that is catalytic. And that's kind of the challenge for you guys.
I think there's some interesting research on this as well from Anne Campbell, who wrote a chapter for the book, but also did her PhD thesis and continues doing research on scholarships mostly in Eastern Europe, but also a little bit in Central Asia. And she looks at alumni networks in countries where there have been a lot of government scholarship recipients, and from her results, I don't want to speak too much to her work without having done it myself, but there's quite a stark difference in the social change impacts and the capacity of scholarship recipients to be involved in policy making, to be involved in advocating for change in countries with fairly robust support networks of alumni. And I think that that's partly because, it's partly because of what Robin said about support to be not alone all of the time, if you're in a difficult situation. And also I think it's a little bit about critical mass and collaboration. So, I mean, we talk about that also in the book in some places, some of the ways that scholarship program designers have looked at the idea of critical mass and how you facilitate people to work together who have a shared viewpoint, shared outlook. And one way is that you have them all go home to work for the same organization, That's the kind of World Bank approach sometimes. Another way is that you have really robust and vibrant alumni networks that allow people to come together to facilitate collaboration. And it's quite interesting to look at some of the outputs of that research. I definitely commend it to anybody.
Right. I would say that this whole discussion raises an underlying point, which is something that I treat in the chapter in the book that I wrote with our colleague from Mexico, David Navarrete, which is that context matters, and the assessment of people's trajectories has to begin with not only where they're from, but what kinds of conditions they're emerging from. What does their educational journey look like, and what are the conditions to which they return? So anything as simple as understanding that if you're returning to your home country in the midst of a recession, your employment prospects may be much more negative than someone who is returning to a neighboring country that's going through an economic boom. And so those kinds of contextual issues really need to be brought into not only the design questions, but the output and outcome evaluations. And yet I think partly because most of the programs that we're talking about, even if they're national for outbound students or are envisioned on a global level, and so the specificities of context get lost in general design. And while you don't want to paralyze yourselves about making any kind of overall statement, I think it's also important to understand that the outcomes are just totally conditioned by what are the available spaces. And this is what Anne Campbell's research shows very clearly. I recall, perhaps it's in the book chapter or another piece she wrote, conditions in Moldova versus Georgia for returning scholars. People had been on the same kinds of programs. And in the Georgian case, they were going through a kind of political thaw. There was more room to have an impact. In the Moldovan case, quite the contrary, very little space. Or we saw that in the chapter I wrote with David, that depending on even the kind of village you were from in Mexico, for two indigenous scholars, both of whom had good qualifications, one had a set of skills that was very useful at that particular moment in that particular place, the other less so. So those kinds of nuances are not extraneous to a research design. They're in fact necessary for understanding what differential impacts can look like.
I think that raises a really important point actually about how we understand the outcome of scholarship programs. So I mean, there are really two ways you can understand the outcomes of anything, and that's relative or absolute. And most of the ways we talk about the outcomes of scholarship programs are absolute. So we talk about number of people in leadership positions, types of development activities people are involved in, career trajectories in a kind of absolute sense, number of people working on X or Y. And that's one way of understanding outcomes, and that's probably the way that's more pertinent to understanding international development, qua the global development goals, or the global goals rather, the SDGs, or their predecessors. The other way, the relative way, is probably more relevant to programs like Joan mentioned the Ford International Fellowship Program before, where actually individuals have gone on pretty incredible trajectories, but they may still not end up in absolute positions which are as stellar as local elites within the countries that they were selected from, just by virtue of the conditions, or indeed because of recession or political issues at home. They may well not end up in stellar positions, but their relative trajectory has been really quite successful. And I think that when you look at the outcomes of scholarship programs, you have to choose to a certain extent what you're going to focus on, relative trajectories or absolute outcomes.
Can I say, go back also to the alumni question and the post-graduation enhancements, or something relevant to what Joan and Matt were saying too. A number of the success cases that I've looked at in Africa, for instance, and this also has to do with those that return home immediately or maybe later, maybe not at all. But for those that, during the independence period of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of these scholarships, the main goal was capacity building, to come back and to head institutions of higher learning and to enter public service and so on and so forth. And there were many funders, from the United Nations to USAID, Rockefeller, and so forth. So when they returned, and on the whole they did, a lot returned to very difficult political and economic, exciting, a high patriotism at that time, but very difficult political and economic environments with, poorly equipped institutions and so forth. So what I'm finding, and this comes back to the alumni network and the post-scholarship enhancement, that those that really thrived were ones that did have that international collaboration lifeline. And so literally the conditions were such that they would have left the country. Remember, they're holding prestigious degrees, so they can leave the country. But what made them stay was certain kinds of relationships that they could pull out to survive these times. And these were with faculty, with fellow peers, with the programs that they attended, who were looking for partners in the countries that they lived in, that they were involved in African research in one way or another. Here they had this resource, these terrifically trained local people who could then be their counterparts for research projects, for grants, for exchange programs. They could bring them in as visiting scholars. And just to get over this period that could be as long as a decade of hardship, they received the income, the support, the status, the connection, with ongoing research that got them through. And now they're in leadership positions. Some of them are prime ministers, some of them are working, but it was touch and go, and from the former Soviet republics, OSF and as I said, there's been, a lot of brain drain from there because the conditions were so poor, and maybe they hadn't developed those international collaborations. And so it was hardship, and it led to out-migration upon their return. So for Australia, if you have a number of alumni that are returning to countries that are going through difficult transitions now, and the goal is that they do return, then it's interesting to think about how can the alma mater institutions and the faculty and the programs provide this kind of lifeline that is mutually beneficial. Because, of course, those universities get a lot out of having highly trained collaborators. So I just wanted to share that as something I think we need to think about. We phrase it as continuing international collaborations. And yeah.
I think that also raises another more general finding of the book about the evaluation research tends to be a snapshot in time. Particularly when focused on, as Matt put it, these absolute outcomes. And yet in today's world where mobility has many forms and people do go back and forth, the kind of draconian nature of the choices of stay or go dilemmas are not quite as severe as they were, and we see all kinds of programs trying to harness the not only financial resources but knowledge and contributions of diaspora populations. And so there's a new context for the value of the international experience, which is reflected in the hybrid programs, in more short-term programs. And I think the beauty is that you don't really have to decide which is the most effective. There will be a multiplicity of objectives. but that almost everyone should be able to have some kind of global mobility, physical or digital, and as the world comes closer together, it's easier to take advantage of this. And the general point, though, is that the impacts, particularly the impacts that go beyond the individual scholarship holder, unfold over time. And one or two longitudinal studies have tried to take that on, but in general, donors are not very sympathetic to the idea of a 10 or 20 or 30-year tracer study. And then you have to do what Robin did, go back and try to reconstruct, or what was the case for Commonwealth or the Fulbright program, other long-standing programs that have gone back and tried to reconstruct these, the baseline. So I think an important recommendation that comes out of the book is that for a relatively minimal cost, you can in fact build in an evaluation component that will at least give you a baseline data, so that this temporal dimension of investment in education, which takes a very long time to bear fruit, is recognized from the outset.
That sounds like an excellent point to finish on, given that our time constraints, and also that the other session as part of this networking event will be an update from the Australia Awards Tracer facility. So perfect segue there. Thanks, Joan.
Perfect. Anna, are you using the video or is it just the audio?
So I'll use the video. So I will stop the recording now.
Great.
Thank you all for being with us today from the many parts of the world that you're all in. So I'll stop. Great.